A very good afternoon, distinguished guests, speakers, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sylvia and I have the pleasure of being your MC today. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, ISAS and US, and of the Bangladesh High Commission in Singapore, I welcome you to this afternoon joint panel discussion titled Bangladesh, the Next Level of Development. To start the proceeding, I would like now to invite Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman, ISAS and US, and Ambassador at Large, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Singapore, to deliver the opening remarks. Ambassador Pillai, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. High Commissioner of Bangladesh, Mr Md Mustafizur Rahman, High Commissioner of Pakistan, High Commissioner of Sri Lanka, and Singapore's High Commissioner to Bangladesh, Mr David. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I'm indeed very happy to be here and to welcome you for this event that we have organized. We have been very regular in arranging these functions, and this is the first one we have had for a long time with Bangladesh. I think we had one just before the President of Bangladesh came here. That was pretty good, and now we have this. As you know, ISAS has got a following in Singapore. We cover the South Asian region extremely well. Main emphasis has always been India because of its size and the fact that the stakeholders that we have are mainly interested in India. But we have now tried to build up expertise in the other region, other countries. And we will be coming out with a book on Pakistan at 17. Dr. Chowdhury is a co-editor together with Javed Burki. And then we have another book that's being planned by a young man who used to be with us. He's in Pakistan, and he has written a book, and he has sent us a proposal to have that launched here. We will be doing that. So we are particularly noted now as a body, as an institution that concentrates on South Asia, and we are the first name to be recalled when they talk about South Asia in this part of the world. I have a very soft corner for Bangladesh. Long before the world recognized Bangladesh as an area where textiles manufacturing is taking root, I was general manager of a Singapore government-linked company called Intraco, it's a state trading corporation. And we set up our first investment in South Asia, in Bangladesh. It was a company called Seasonal Garments, and we started making garments and exporting them. All the others were our followers. We started it, and we established it, we worked with it. We have subsequently, recently, I have, through the good offices of Dr. Chowdhury, took a small ISAS team to Bangladesh, and we had extremely good discussion, and we also signed an MOU with one of the think tanks. The previous seminar that we had, or discussion that we had, was with Cosmos, just before the President came to, President of Bangladesh came here. This particular episode that we are going to have is to discuss the progress that Bangladesh has made from LDC, least developed country, to a developing country. This is very significant. It shows the growth that that Bangladesh is going through, and how it is recognized by the world. These rankings are not given by Bangladesh or any one of us. It is given by by people who specialize in this sort of thing. Bangladesh's growth has been quite significant. The economy is progressing at a steady pace and roughly at 6% a year. It is one of the world's largest exporters of garments. And one of the significant things about Bangladesh, it has empowered women. I have a theory that countries that empower women tend to progress faster economically. And not a joke, I meant it as serious. And I've seen states in India, for instance. If you take the states where the women are hid behind pardas, they progress much slowly, much less significantly than states that empower women. So Bangladesh has done that. And then, of course, Bangladesh has got intellectual resources, which is, I would say, of a superior kind. Once I was told that the Bangladeshi workers in Singapore, they work hard and, they seem to be so engrossed in doing, construction work and sort of thing. But what I didn't know was some of them were poets. They write poetry. So ISAS held a poetry reading of Bangladeshi workers. We had, if I remember correctly, about 8 poets who had their poems read. They read it. We had on the side an English translation on the screen. And it was a tremendous success. And this shows the caliber of the people. So for them to grow is something I would think quite natural, because they have the intellectual capacity. Now, the change from LDC to a developing country status also involves certain challenges, because some of the benefits that you get as an LDC is no longer available, because the country, the world gives you soft credit and all sorts of things if you are LDC. But when you move up, they sort of punish you by taking all that away, and you've got to strive again, which is, I find illogical, because even if you're a developing country, you need quite a lot of help, and Bangladesh has those. In becoming the developing country, it satisfies certain prerequisites that are set upon it. It should attract, but the change should attract more foreign investment, and we think that eventually that would make up for the loss of the goodies that the various institutions, international institutions, give to the country. And I think Bangladesh will benefit. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a panel of good speakers. I'm very grateful to Dr. Chowdhury for agreeing to chair. I must say that I'm very grateful to the High Commissioner for agreeing to be the keynote speaker, and I hope you will have a good afternoon discussion. We should listen to the speakers and engage them in, with comments and interaction. I hope you will have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Pillai. I would now like to invite His Excellency Md Mustafizur Rahman, High Commissioner of Bangladesh to Singapore, to deliver his address. His Excellency will be speaking on the topic, graduating from the list of least developed countries, what it means for Bangladesh. Your Excellency, please.
Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of Institute of South Asian Studies, Dr. Iftekhar A Chowdhury, Senior Officials of ISAS, distinguished panelists, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. Let me at the outset thank the Institute of South Asian Studies for joining us in organizing this seminar. This event is being held at the backdrop of recent declaration by the UN that Bangladesh is eligible to graduate out of least developed countries group. It is indeed a watershed moment in our national history. When Bangladesh achieved independence in 1971, many doubted the future of the country. It was dubbed as an economic basket case by some. From that situation, the country has made a great stride, a complete economic turnaround. Bangladesh today is the 32nd largest economy in the world, with a GDP of 220 billion US dollar. Export volume is 35 billion US dollar, and the foreign currency reserve is over 33 billion US dollar, which is the second largest in South Asia. It is now a politically stable, economically sound, and socially thriving country. Ladies and gentlemen, the transformation of Bangladesh has taken place over the past 2 decades, but accelerated in the last decade under the leadership of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. During this period, the country's economy has marked a steady growth, with its benefits spreading across society. The growth has been accompanied by significant decline in poverty, increase in employment, greater access to education and healthcare services. This transformation has been facilitated by the success of garment industry and sustained inflow of remittance. Progress in our social indicators in recent years have also been very impressive. In terms of gender equality, women empowerment, mortality rate, life expectancy, immunization and access to health, water and sanitation, we are far better compared to many of our South Asian neighbors. We achieved targets of universal primary school enrollment and gender parity in primary and secondary schools well ahead of MDG targets. Our national poverty rate has dropped from 57% to 22% in less than 2 decades. Life expectancy has increased to 72 years. Our microcredit programs have helped rural women become economically empowered. Politically also, our women are increasingly visible and active. Bangladesh is possibly the only country today where women simultaneously hold high positions of Prime Minister, Speaker, Leader of the Opposition, and the Deputy Leader of the Parliament. Bangladesh has reached the benchmark of lower middle income status classified by the World Bank in 2015. This year, we fulfilled all 3 criteria: gross national income per capita, human assets index, and economic vulnerability index for graduation from the LDC group. And that's the occasion for us having here. Now the question is, what the LDC graduation means for Bangladesh. If you look at the history, the 5 countries that have graduated from the LDC category since 1971, Botswana, Cape Verde, the Maldives, Samoa, and Equatorial Guinea, all are characterized as small countries. On the contrary, Bangladesh is the first big LDC, in fact the biggest LDC in terms of population, size of economy, to leave behind the LDC status. This is a remarkable feat. My friends from other LDC countries used to say, you don't deserve to be an LDC. In fact, it is the per capita income that stood on our way of graduation earlier. This is perhaps the main reason why we are an LDC in the first place. Still, if the experience of earlier graduates is a guide, LDC graduation presents both opportunities and challenges for us. The foremost among the opportunities is the brand value. It is expected that developed Bangladesh will command confidence of investors and creditors, drawing more investment in the country. It will allow us greater access to multilateral as well as public and private funds and credits with more favorable terms. This in turn will generate greater momentum in increasing our productive capacities, product diversification, and production of higher valued goods and services. LDC graduation may also help Bangladesh negotiate for and engage in free trade agreement, regional trade agreement with the major trading partners, which are expected to boost our trade and exports. On the other hand, the graduation presents significant challenges as well. The biggest challenge is the phasing out of special differential treatment that Bangladesh receives as an LDC. This has also been mentioned by the Chairman Pillai. This will entail loss of preferential market access under LDC-specific schemes. There are about 136 LDC-specific international support schemes across the spectrum of trade, finance, technology transfer, and technical assistance. Unless negotiated with relevant partners, most of these measures would eventually be phased out. So, what are the possible challenges of graduation awaiting us? I have identified 4 in broad sense. First, as I mentioned earlier, Bangladesh will experience significant erosion of preferences affecting its export competitiveness, industrial productions, and jobs. As per our own one estimate, abolition of LDC preferential treatment of DFQF, which is duty-free, quota-free access, would result in a possible annual export loss of 2.7 billion Thai, which is roughly 8.5% of Bangladesh's export. Second, due to its elevated economic status, Bangladesh would see a shift from IDA type of concessional foreign aid to IBRD type of non-concessional finance with higher interest rates and stringent conditions. Accessing alternative types of concessional finance would be very difficult for us. Third, graduation would also cause erosion of facilities and relaxations in relation to intellectual property rights, as well as other obligations in trade matters under WTO. Fourth, we are passing through a tumultuous period of history with conservatism, protectionism, extremism, refugee crisis, and confrontations of many other kinds on the rise. Under these circumstances, sustaining the momentum of social and economic development for smooth graduation would be challenging. So the government has a big responsibility to map out a clear strategy to face all these challenges and mitigate the consequences of graduation. Luckily, the graduation will take place in 2024. There will be a grace period of another 3 years when Bangladesh will enjoy all LDC-specific benefits. In total, we'll have approximately 10 years to prepare for the new journey. I'm not an expert on economic issues, Nonetheless, I think for a smooth transition, we should focus on the following. First of all, our overall capacity in running the state economy needs to be further improved. We must transform our human resources into capital through education and skill development. We need to generate employment opportunities for the youth through industrialization and increasing manpower export. We have to attract more foreign direct investment in the country. This is an age of artificial intelligence and robotics. We must gear up to embrace this fourth generation of industrialization. Secondly, we have to improve our export competitiveness and diversify our products, explore new markets to compensate the loss from preference erosion and under various international support measures. We must look for exports beyond garments. I clearly see that pharmaceuticals and ICT are two very promising sectors which can boost our export and help decrease reliance on garments. Good thing is, we have a courageous and prudent political leadership. Ambitious, energetic, and hardworking people who are ready to face any challenge. After all, it's a nation who fought for its liberation not too long ago and overcome many national crises since then. The people of Bangladesh are delighted that they do not have to bear the stigma of LDC anymore. They are aware that the successful graduation would be an important stepping stone to the national aspiration to become a middle-income country by 2021 and perhaps an advanced economy by 2041. The people have made sacrifices in the past. If needed be, they will make it again for greater national interest. With these few words, and wishing a very rich and fruitful panel discussion, I conclude my remarks.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We will now break for a tea reception outside the ballroom. Please be back to the ballroom by 3:45. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We will now proceed to the panel discussion. I would like to introduce the distinguished chairperson and the panelists for the session. The chairperson, Dr. Iftekhar A Chowdhury, Principal Research Fellow, ISAS and US, and former Foreign Minister of Bangladesh. The panelists, Ms. Ayesha Aziz Khan, Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer, Summit Power International. Dr. Monzur Hossain, Senior Research Fellow, Bangladesh Institute of Development Studies, and Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economics, ISAS and US. I will now hand the floor to Dr. Chowdhury.
Thank you, Sylvia. Chairman Gopinath Pillai, High Commissioner Mustafizur Rahman, High Commissioners, Ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, and what we deem as friends of ISAS. A very warm welcome to you all. To our panel discussion on And the topic today is Bangladesh, the next level of development. The introductory remarks by Chairman Gopinath Pillai and High Commissioner Mustafizur Rahman have set the tone for our deliberations. I'll take a few minutes to lay out the framework for the panel discussion that will follow, and propose to do so by briefly delineating the parameters of the global role that Bangladesh plays. This is the role of Bangladesh on the matrix of the global sea. This has to naturally do with Bangladesh's foreign policy, something that an area with which I myself have been very closely associated for over 4 decades. In foreign policy, Bangladesh has 2 major aspirations. Now, this is not policy per se, these are aspirations. Aspirations, and eventually that is the broad strategy. You have goals, and thereafter you will have methods, the tactics to achieve the goals. The first aspiration is naturally the preservation of its sovereignty and security. Now, this required sufficient space for maneuverability in policy formulation. Now, this requirement also implied a behavior pattern that warranted the need to live in concord with, but distinct from, a powerful, albeit friendly, neighbor, India. The second aspiration was efforts, endeavors to obtain resources for development. Now, this meant connections with the United States, Europe, China, Japan, and the Middle East, as well as the international financial and trade institutions like the UN, for instance, WTO, the Bretton Woods institutions, etc. Now, these connections were aimed at satisfying the demands for aid, trade, investments, and employment of the excess workforce. Now, these aspirations called for a policy, now we come to the foreign policy itself, that required a very high level of international interactions, both with the global powers, with the key global powers, and the multilateral institutions that I have named. A natural corollary was eschewing flashy foreign policy involvements and opting for low-key postures on global crisis. Now, this is theoretical. When you have that kind of requirement, having to interact with so many global actors, and you require to interact with them in a friendly ambiance, you have to limit the flashiness of your external relations. Since economic development necessitated global order and global stability, Bangladesh floated the concept of regional cooperation through SAARC, and also supported the United Nations to the extent possible, as in peacekeeping, since Bangladesh possessed a very well-trained military. This strategy and tactics helped Bangladesh to retain a modicum of goodwill internationally in the region and overseas globally. Within the region, with India, relations were on an even keel, with a successful land boundary agreement signed, though the resolution of river water distribution still hangs fire. With Myanmar, the influx into Bangladesh of 1 million Rohingya refugees created a problem. But so far, however, Bangladesh has had international empathy without denting too much the bilateral relations with Myanmar. Now, to my mind, a key element of Bangladesh's international linkages has been the global understanding of the prime need of its energy policy, that is in the area of nuclear power. Now, we have not yet discussed this in any ISAS forum as yet. In November last year, Bangladesh became the third nuclear newcomer country in the past 3 decades. In 30 years, Bangladesh was the first newcomer as a nuclear country. This is after the United Arab Emirates in 2012 and Belarus in 2013. Belarus, of course, was a part of the Soviet Union, had access to nuclear energy anyway. The nuclear plant in Rupur, that's about 60 kilometers from Dhaka, it's a 12 or 13 billion US dollars project funded largely by Russia. And it will become operational in 2023-24. It is purported to provide 11,200 kilowatt of gross electric power. This will mean that Bangladesh will become the 3rd South Asian country after India and Pakistan to access nuclear energy. Bangladesh is, of course, absolutely committed to the peaceful use of its nuclear power. Needless to say, the story of Bangladesh, of which you have heard some already, but the story of Bangladesh's development is an extremely interesting one. The next level of development will see both prospects and, of course, challenges. To speak to these, we have a very distinguished panel, whom I will introduce one by one. The CVs are there with you at your desk. Now, the point I want to make is that development cannot be achieved by governments alone. The people have a major role. Bangladeshis must draw a lesson from what the mighty Rabindranath Tagore had said. And he had said, if you wish to cross the sea, it is not enough just to stand at its edge and merely stare at the waters. I thank you. Okay, we will commence the panel discussions. And the first speaker on my list would be Ms. Ayesha Aziz Khan. She's the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Summit Park International, and she'll speak to Bangladesh's infrastructure development and social
I'll just sit here. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Chowdhury, for having me. Thank you, Ambassador Pillai, for encouraging South Asia continuously by supporting. For encouraging South Asia and Singapore's focus on South Asia. I think that itself, that all of us are sitting over here, is a big encouragement for Bangladesh. And finally, Ambassador, thank you so much for supporting all the Bangladeshis living here, for Bangladeshis businesses working out of Singapore. I'll briefly introduce myself. I work for a company called Summit Power International. We're based in Singapore. We're headquartered in Singapore. We're the largest independent power producer in Bangladesh, generating about 1,500 megawatts of electricity and doubling our capacity as we speak. Mr. Chowdhury, when he called me to discuss today, he was talking about discussing something about women in business. And when we discussed what would make more sense, and he was kind enough and gracious enough to discuss with me what we can talk about, and we came to the idea that infrastructure and its effect on social development would be something that I can speak about. Women's entrepreneurship, I'm neither an entrepreneur, and definitely I'm not a female entrepreneur. I work for a company, I'm a managing director and CEO. It's not a company I've built up. So it's a very different role, entrepreneurship versus what I do. So I didn't want to speak about something I have no knowledge about. Whereas infrastructure and its effect on social development and how closely that is linked to women's empowerment is something that I do believe I would like to speak about and ask all of you to think about. Women's empowerment. Mike. It's going to go there. This isn't working out.
That's a better way.
Women's empowerment is very closely linked with the social development of the country. We can't think of one without the other. Countries that have infrastructure growth, countries that have infrastructure, the first thing it sees is the impact on social development. You cannot aim for social development without having infrastructure, and infrastructure's primary purpose is to ensure a country grows in a sustainable manner. Countries that have based their growth either on commodities, natural resources, or just services find at some point in the line, some point along the development line, a disconnect between society and the economic growth taking place, because without having infrastructure, that economic growth finds it very challenging to seep through to all levels of society. Specifically women. Whenever we talk about women and women's empowerment, one of the words that is used very much is protective policies, and I would like to submit very humbly that that's not the word to use. What we require is supportive policy. Women do not need protection. We are very good and we're very strong enough on our own. What we require is supportive policies and supportive frameworks that enable us to thrive. And as 50% of the population, all of us who are playing roles in different kinds of policy making would want us to participate in a significant manner. And that's where infrastructure comes in. I have a slide, yeah, thank you. Who's doing my slides? Oh, there you go. Thank you, Damien. I have a slide over here that talks about how infrastructure filters through. The first infrastructure is really an ideological infrastructure. It's democracy and free market. Presuming that we are all in agreement of that, and maybe some of you may not be, and some of us may have thoughts about it, which is fair enough, but presuming we accept democracy and free market as the first stepping stone, first infrastructural stepping stone, then what we want to go for is a sustainable modern society. To have that, infrastructure starts playing a very good, very important, very significant role, to the point where without physical infrastructure, having that sustainable modern society almost becomes an impossibility. Of the physical infrastructure, power resulting in industrial activities which result in employment is the first part of the equation to get us to the answers that we all want to. Electricity, they say, is the infrastructure of infrastructure. Throughout my discussion, the 2 points that I'll keep going back to is electricity and its role in infrastructure, and of course infrastructure and its effect on social development and specifically women. Bangladesh's progress in providing power to its people is something we've all seen, we're all talking about it, and we've seen the impact it has. In the last 10 years, we have been able to increase our electricity generation capacity by about 8,000 megawatts. The effect of that on industrialization, on manufacturing capacity is extraordinary. One of the recent things that happened was about a few years back, a ready-made garments factory had an accident and it collapsed, and the people working there it was a horrible accident resulting in many deaths. Electricity plays a very important role because it allows the manufacturing industry, specifically RMG industry and the textile industry that Bangladesh is strongly focused on, to become safer. There is more things that can be automated, buildings that can be automated that triggers safety warnings. So not only is it a direct contributor to the economic inflow that ready-made garments and industries have, but infrastructure provides the social fabric that is required to make sure this industry is thriving. And then finally, a discussion about to enable infrastructure, what do we need? What are the enablers of infrastructure? Something I'll be talking throughout the next 20 minutes. The biggest challenge in Bangladesh to enable infrastructure is the supply of energy, the feedstock or the raw energy, and what will that be? For Bangladesh, we've been very lucky and we have domestic gas for the last 20 years. As of 2-3 years back, our government, which has behaved in a very matured, in a very future-looking, with a very future-looking ideology, realized that energy can become a bottleneck and has allowed for LNG to be brought into the country. I want to touch upon that is because LNG and the way that will affect Bangladesh is the part where Singapore and Bangladesh will finally have the strongest connection, apart from the very strong connection we already have of so many Bangladeshis living in Singapore. Bangladesh is a country of 170 million people. Therefore, this is a country where the labor market is something that has an extraordinary effect on its politics, on its macroeconomic growth, on its society, on how it will develop. Infrastructure requires to come in such a way whereby it supports this labor market. I have a slide that shows how the population compared to other countries and how the GDP has doubled. GDP has doubled in Bangladesh over the last 10 years. To make sure this remains sustainable, to make sure this continues to grow, infrastructure is again necessary. Infrastructure, both physical and social infrastructure, enables the labor force to become a contributing capital. Ambassador was kind enough to speak about labor becoming capital rather than just human beings becoming human capital. And that enabling factor is again infrastructure, both physical and social infrastructure. One of the examples I like to think about is what Singapore has done with the HDBs. The moment a country is able to give a physical infrastructure to most of its population, whereby they have a sense of ownership and a sense of belonging, a sense of support, the society, the people who are dependent on that thrive. For social development to happen in Bangladesh, we need to empower females, we need to empower the parts of society that do not have access to the kind of growth opportunities some of us sitting over here do. And over there, again, infrastructure is very important. We need infrastructure to start getting this 165 million people, out of which about 60% still live in rural areas, give them access to education, allow them to go to colleges, allow them to go to universities and training so they can be employed and they can turn into human capital. And then finally, after that step, we need to provide them the kind of infrastructure that will support them to thrive in their employment. With 170 million people, we cannot afford to be lax on this. Anything that happens in Bangladesh, even what may be considered a small pebble in such a big country or such a big economy, 2% of the country is about 2 million people. Something that affects only 2% of the country still affects about 2/3 of Singapore's population. So that's the kind of scenario we have in Bangladesh, and that's the kind of thoughts and policies we have to cater to make sure the infrastructure is there where people can access the kind of development life, the kind of road that they need to go to be able to work together, to be able to grow together, and to be able to thrive. When you have that, the challenges that, again, Ambassador was mentioning about terrorism, about fundamentalism, about political challenges, those significantly decrease. If people have basic infrastructure to live their life well, access to education, access to communication, access to healthcare, and access to energy, people tend to do well in a sustainable manner. There's less conflict amongst society, less conflict amongst pools of different economic parts of the society. Singapore has done very well on racial cohesion and working together as a country is, again, I think a large part has to do with HDB. People live together, people work together, people learn about each other, living in same buildings. That gives them a sense of respect, and that gives them a sense of belonging together. Bangladesh doesn't have a challenge in having a very diverse population the way Singapore does, but what Bangladesh does have is a population that can be pulled into two very different schools of thoughts. One which is modern, one which is growing very fast and sustainable and goes along with the rest of the world, with Southeast Asia, which Singapore and its neighboring countries would want, and the other which is much more backward, much more conflict-oriented, much more thinking about, much more focused on creating
what's the word to say, much more thinking about creating a disparity within the society. And that's what we all need to work towards to avoid, to make sure that every member of the country is working together. This 165 million people, the way they grow, the way they are in 10 years' time, will affect all of us sitting over here. It will affect India, it will affect Sri Lanka, it will affect Pakistan. So all of us together need to know how to improve the lives of 170 million people. Infrastructure and the way the country's focus has been on both social infrastructure and physical infrastructure has resulted in this slide that's behind me. Every one of these slides, life expectancy at birth, maternal mortality, secondary school enrollment, all of them have improved significantly over the last 10-15-year period. This is because the country has focused on infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and also social infrastructure. Our indicators on the social development side, like life expectancy at birth, maternal mortality, and access to immunization is significantly better than our regional neighbors. And the reason for this is because of an infrastructure that the country and the government at that time decided to implement on healthcare. Our country is a small country, our country is a poor country, but almost everyone has access to basic primary care. And by basic primary care, what I mean is population control or access to birth control, access to immunization for children, and basic health care necessary for mothers while they're giving birth. That small change in our policies have affected the country to result in these growth rates. We don't have hospitals, and we are far away from having hospitals in every part of the country. We are far away from having surgical procedures available to the whole population. But it's this basic change and this basic ability of a very basic medical service or healthcare service that was provided to the population with the support of the World Bank, with the support of the World Health Organization about 15 years back, that has resulted in this. This is a slide I want to show to you, to submit to you the difference in infrastructure. Physical infrastructure and social infrastructure can actually change society as a whole. It can change. We talk about social development, we talk about empowerment, we talk about equality, we talk about equal rights for all. If you can't give people infrastructure where they can have the opportunity to access the same rights, have the opportunity, same growth, you will not have equal rights, you will not have empowerment, you will not have a sustainable development goal, because there will always be somebody who will stay behind. There will always be a part of the population who will be left behind, because they just can't access what parts of the country are offering. Infrastructure is the biggest connector of people who do not have with the people or sources that do have. Are we there yet? Of course not. This slide is on electricity. It's a slide I'm going to use because electricity is the sector that I work in, but it's a reflection of a lot of the infrastructure in Bangladesh. In electricity, we're actually more ahead than maybe healthcare or education. Two other infrastructure where there requires to be a lot of work done and a lot of investments done. You'll see the dark blue line is actually the total generation, but that is not what's available to the people. That's the lowest line, the 9,000 megawatt is the maximum generation available to the country right now as we speak. The gap between the maximum generation capacity and the peak demand is about 3,000 megawatts. What is the result of this 3,000 megawatt? Effect on social development. 3,000 megawatts mean there are times when hospitals have to not be able to operate. So you have the capital already utilized in having the instruments and doctors employed, but you're not being able to utilize them because there is no electricity. What does this 3,000 megawatt further mean? This 3,000 megawatt further means there are universities that are not being able to teach students when they need to. It further means factories that should be running at the time when they can deliver, where they have everything else in place, they're not being able to deliver their production capacity just because of lack of electricity. Lack of infrastructure can have a systematic effect on everything else. In economics, you always talk about the effect of a small effect that can result in a bigger effect in the whole economy as a whole. Infrastructure is the opposite of that. Every time infrastructure is not available, the multiplier effect of that lack of availability is significant. It's not just that plant not being running for 2 hours or 3 hours and that plant not earning its revenue. That lack of availability or that lack of availability of infrastructure, whether it's electricity, whether it's roads and transports, or whether it's healthcare, or whether it's education, results in many other effects to the society. The last slide is, in spite of the extraordinary achievement of Bangladesh, this is how we have been able to grow in electricity generation or providing power to our population. With this kind of a growth, we are still not being able to provide electricity to the entire country. About 30% of the country does not have access to electricity. That means they actually don't have a switch to turn on the light. The 70% that have the ability to press the switch and turn on the light, about 20% of the time they can turn on the switch, but the light won't turn on. 30% of the country just doesn't even have access to electricity. So there's no switch, there is no availability of electricity for them. We need to fix this. We need to think of ways to fix this. And of course, for physical infrastructure to happen, whether it's electricity or transport, the biggest bottleneck becomes capital. And again, that's where Singapore plays a role. I was talking to Ambassador of Singapore to Bangladesh, and one of the places Singapore will play a stronger and a bigger role to Bangladesh is to become a source of capital. Singapore is a mature capital market and the closest capital market in terms of physical proximity to Bangladesh. The next big capital market is Hong Kong, which is further away and much more disconnected. Singapore can significantly influence and support and empower the way Bangladesh's infrastructure will grow by becoming the capital center to deploy capital back into Bangladesh. Summit Power International is the first company to do this, and we're very grateful for the support both the Bangladesh government and the Singapore government has given to us to enable this. But my submission to all of us over here who are involved in policy making and thoughts, that this should become systematic, whereby it's not just the largest company being able to access this, but every company that can access this, every person that can access this. Being the largest IPP or being the largest company gives you certain advantages, so we can access certain things that many other companies can't. We need a system to enable everybody to access this, not just Summit, not just Ayesha, who can access many other growth opportunities all over the country. For me to be here, I'm very grateful, but it's much easier for me to be here than for 99% of the country's population. And that's what we have to figure out. How can we support Bangladesh, and how can we support the society to enable them to attract capital so it reaches everyone, not only for people like Ayesha or specifically companies like Summit. For us, we already have a very visible platform. There are multiple sources we can go to. IFC, part of the World Bank Group, is one of our co-investors. General Electric is a partner of ours. So we have large partners everywhere. We need policies, and we need enabling policies that allows for the smaller players to thrive and come out. The next slide is a little bit more about access to electricity, and to just give you a picture of how we're doing compared to other countries. As you can see, Bangladesh is behind Vietnam, and in every other way, Bangladesh's credit rating is the same as Vietnam. So if we are to presume the biggest bottleneck, and which is a reasonable presumption to make, the biggest bottleneck for infrastructure is capital, with having the same credit rating as Vietnam, we really shouldn't have this disparity between Vietnam and Bangladesh. When you're raising capital, credit rating is a very good reflection of what you should be able to access. If Vietnam is able to access that capital market to be able to give electricity to all its population, Bangladesh, just keeping everything else the same and just working on those two parameters, should again also be able to do the same. Because of this, what the bottleneck needs to be removed. We need to open up the capital market. We need to be able to open up the capital market in both ways, both inflow into Bangladesh and outflow into Bangladesh. Capital will never go to a place where it will not be able to come out of. Capital must grow. Capital must go to a place, grow over there, and have an ability to come out. Capital is not, it's not a long-term relationship. It's not a marriage. It's definitely not a lifetime commitment. It goes in, does its job, comes out, and then has to go back somewhere else to again reinvest. So both the matured economies like Singapore and Bangladesh and the lawmakers and of both sides need to work together to figure out how to enable this. Then finally comes the private sector. As soon as you open up the capital and capital inflow, private sector can play a stronger and stronger role. For infrastructure in Bangladesh, we have done this with electricity, with the Private Sector Power Generation Act, which was established in the mid-90s. We need to now enable the private sector to participate in other infrastructure. We need to open up infrastructure to the private sector so they can bring in capital. They can open up the bottleneck. When you can open up the bottleneck of providing capital to the private sector to deliver infrastructure or to grow infrastructure, all the other barriers that we were talking about of infrastructure not being there and its effect on society and development, those things slowly start opening up as well. Because what private sector is able to do very efficiently is to deploy small amounts of capital in the best possible, most efficient way. The state deploys capital in a very large-scale manner. And whenever you're talking about large-scale capital deployment, there is inefficiency, there's leakages, and different people can give different terms to it. But it happens almost everywhere. Because when you are deploying capital in a very large-scale manner, there will be pockets of inefficiency. Whereas, whenever you break up this capital flow and asks the private sector to do it, it becomes efficient. One of the amazing examples is China. China was able to do this without having a so-called democracy, or I think China has done a much better job of breaking up this bottleneck and allowing capital to be deployed on a private sector basis or on a private decision-making basis in a significant manner, much better than countries that claim to have free market and claim to have democracies. So there's a lot to learn from there, that when we're talking about opening up the bottleneck of capital or opening up capital inflow and outflow, we're not talking about a place where the state loses all control. We're not talking about a place where you have to break away all regulations. You can be well regulated, the state can have a control, but still when the decision making is privatized, when the decision making comes to a scale that's reasonable for a few people to monitor, the deployment of that capital becomes much more efficient. How has Bangladesh again done this for electricity? Bangladesh has done this for electricity by having a very strong private sector power generation policy. There's a clear government plan, then there is an attractive financial and incentive policies because the private sector does require a return on its capital to deploy it. And then the contracts that the electricity sector has are bankable. Private capital, whether international or local, always finds a way into it. And then we have Speedy Supply of Power and Energy Special Provisions Act, which allows capital to come in a very fast manner. And finally, we have a regulatory process through which arbitration or arguments can be solved. It's with these factors that electricity infrastructure in Bangladesh got privatized, got opened up, and has done extremely well, resulting in strong impact on social development. For me, this is an example. We can definitely do this in education and healthcare. If you can open up the education sector and the healthcare sector in Bangladesh and the communication sector in Bangladesh through these policies, and then open up the inflow of capital from external sources to internal sources, allowing that capital to freely come in and freely go out, which is allowed in the electricity sector, then you will see the impact of that in those infrastructure sectors as well, and the impact of that in social development. Electricity being available impacts our lives the most. I will go back to a little bit about women and their ability to work. Bangladesh is known for its remarkable achievement in women's empowerment. This is a result of two things. One is their employment. Compared to other countries, the employment rate of women in Bangladesh is significantly higher. Of the labor force, the participation between women and female is about 40-60, which in other South Asian countries is about 10% women, 80% men. So women earn income. The moment a woman is starting to earn and has ability on her finances, that's when empowerment happens. So we do not need protection. We don't need protective policies. We need policies that enable us to just participate in the economic activity everybody else has the ability, rest of the population has to participate. We don't really require, women's empowerment does not mean women require protection or additional support or additional platform. What we require is to enable us to access the same growth opportunities as our male counterparts. Infrastructure again plays a very strong role in this. Quality infrastructure results in this. Quality physical infrastructure results in quality social infrastructure to happen. As soon as you have your electricity or power supply and your roads and railways and telecommunication sector and communication sector, the next thing that happens is healthcare and childcare improves. To allow women to support 50% of your country's population to participate in economic activity, healthcare and childcare is very important to give to them, and I believe both infrastructure, physical and social infrastructure is what allows that, and that's what creates a social development that's sustainable and passes on to the entire society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ayesha. That was extremely interesting, very good, and covered a very, very broad spectrum of the subject that we're dealing with, infrastructure, etc. Of course, Ayesha was very modest in her own introduction. She's not just the MD of Summit PAR. That is a part of the Summit Group, which is one of our largest developments. Okay, next on my list would be Dr. Monzur Hossain. He's a senior research fellow at the Bangladesh Institute of Development Studies, one of our top think tanks in Dhaka.
A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank ISAS, particularly Dr. A Chowdhury, for inviting me to be here, and also Bangladesh High Commission, who is jointly organizing this important topic. I congratulate both ISAS and Bangladesh High Commission for arranging this kind of discussion at the backdrop of being eligible for the graduation of LDC and sharing this our views and our prosperity with our neighbors and other Singapore stakeholders and all others. So this is a good opportunity for me for having with you all and to discuss about the economic priorities that Bangladesh should focus on. So first of all, I want to look at the main context of after life after LDC. As you already know from our colleagues and other discussion, that Bangladesh has been eligible for being graduated from LDC status, but in 2018 March, UN declared that Bangladesh is being eligible, but the final review will be made on 2024. So Bangladesh has to maintain the current level of all the context by which Bangladesh has been evaluated for being graduated from the LDC status. So what are the criteria that Bangladesh met already to become graduate from the LDC? First of all, the important criteria was per capita income. It is a World Bank, according to World Bank statistics, a country has to maintain $1,230 as according to Atlas method for 3 years on 3 years average to be graduated from the LDC. So Bangladesh already achieved that one, and Bangladesh's current per capita income according to Atlas Math is 1274. But our own calculation it is 1400 above. Okay. So this is one criteria that Bangladesh fulfilled already, and the second one is economic vulnerability index. Bangladesh already passed on this index also. It is very much beyond this level, the threshold level. And third one is human asset index. So with all these aspects, Bangladesh qualified for being graduated from the LDC status. So it is a very auspicious moment for us to have this kind of assessment from the UN, and also this is already our High Commissioner to Singapore already mentioned that this is what we have achieved. We did not declare it by ourselves, so UN already has made an assessment, and this is the reality now. So there are lots of economic priorities to sustain this LDC graduation and beyond. So I will have only a few of them that are very important for sustaining LDC graduation and beyond achieving the developed status. And so what are those priorities? First of all, I would like to mention that we have to maintain the current level of economic growth, and that must be sustaining, and then without having higher economic growth, you cannot have higher per capita income. Then what is needed for us for maintaining the high economic growth? That is the investment. So we have to maintain higher investment. And then already mentioned some of our panelists that we have to diversify our export. I will discuss in detail about this aspect and later. And then of course our growth must be inclusive, and definitely through the reduction of poverty. For maintaining or financing, maintaining higher growth, definitely we have to have a higher investment. So what would be the financing process of that kind of level of development? So as you already heard that some of our colleagues already mentioned that when we will be graduated from the LDC, we will lose some of the concessionary loans, grants and other things. So what do we have to do? Then we have to do we have to look for some alternative and innovative financing for development. What would be those? I will discuss a bit later. And finally, as we already mentioned, that one of the criteria was human capital index. So we have to invest in human capital development. And since Bangladesh is also a very climate vulnerable country, therefore we have to make all the investment which is climate resilient, and of course we have to make some policies that would gear up our sustainable development process. So you can see our growth pattern, and at the same time the income inequality process. You see that Bangladesh has been maintaining very sustainable and impressive growth performance over the last decades and so on. So from 2000s, the decade, we have achieved about 6% level of growth, and then in 2000 and beyond, it is about 7% or more. So it's a very impressive growth performance of Bangladesh, and at the same time, it is way beyond our some comparators. But at the same time, you see that there is a worrying fact is that with higher level of growth, inequality is also increasing. So therefore, it is very important for the government and also to other policymakers to look into the matters so that income inequality could be kept in a level that is acceptable, or at least so that we can reduce the income inequality. So our policies should be like this, that should be pro-poor growth. Okay. Next, the main thing what I want to focus as economic priorities for Bangladesh, that is investment. Already Ayesha mentioned about the investment in the private sector, investment in energy sector, but I want to mention about as a whole. What is the current level of investment in Bangladesh, and what should we do for sustaining our current level of growth? For example, current private investment rate as percentage of GDP is almost stagnant at about 20 to 23% of GDP for last few years. And it needs to be increased to about 28% if we want to achieve the growth level at 8% or more. That is also in our 7-5-year plan target. So public investment is on a rise. That is a good sign. Government has been investing in many mega projects, and this is now almost about 8% of GDP, and it may be around 10% at best. But at the same time, the main concern is to have investment rate more than 20 to 23% of GDP. As I already mentioned, some of you may know that in terms of Harrod-Domar model or incremental capital output ratio, if we want to maintain investment 8% GDP rate, our total investment should be about 35% of total GDP. So we need to increase our private sector investment about 27-28% in the coming years. That is the big challenge for Bangladesh. And what we should do, that is what we have to discuss here also. And you see that the trend of investment rate, the blue line represents the public sector investment, and green line represents the private sector investment. So you see 22-23% in last 7 or 8 years. So this is the most worrying scenario for Bangladesh. Why private sector investment is not growing more and more? Though 22% is not a joke, but still we need more investment from the private sector. First of all, I would like to discuss about the investment for public sector. So the priority areas should be road, bridge, railways, airport, seaport, deep seaport, gas and electricity, definitely, then renewable energy, and climate change adaptation. So these are the areas where public sector investment should go on, and I think the government is on the right track in doing investment in those areas. But still, it is needed, as Ayesha already mentioned, about the energy sector and other sectors also. And also education and health, because our health, human asset index is related to these two areas, health and education. Then you see already, I think already this graph has been shown by Ayesha, the electricity generation and capacity. We have been able to achieve almost 75% of our installed capacities, right? So our generation capacity we could not yet achieve fully. So, and demand is, I think, even more than that generation level. So this is an area where we have to invest more. And what are the necessary topics or what are the necessary priorities? Already Ayesha mentioned some of these. I think those who are thinking to invest in Bangladesh, they will find out more about this. But I would like to highlight some more issues. For example, it is already mentioned that service land is an important aspect for Bangladesh, investment in Bangladesh. This is a concern from the private investors, because land is a scarcity in Bangladesh, and investors usually do not find land, service land, at their will. But for this issue, I think you already may know that government has been establishing about 100 special economic zones. So what is needed is to make quick implementation of these zones and proper policy for utilization. We have already some small industries and cottage industry zones, so we also need to review all those things, why some of the basic plots are not being utilized fully. So this should not be happen in case of special economic zones. Already 2 or 3 special economic zones are almost ready. So this is a good sign for private investment. And there should have a coherent policy. As an economist, we can say that for economic zones, that should be basic. We have a special economic zone, and also we have EPZ, export processing zone. So we have 3 types of zones. We are creating all those for facilitating private investment. So what characterizes the private investment scenarios, why it is not being geared up? First of all, I would say that our financial system is a bit liable for this kind of things. Our system has some problem already, and its interest rate is a bit higher. There are some financial scams and less competitive to some extent. Therefore, it is important for the country or for the government or for the central bank to look into the matter so the financial sector becomes more competitive, they become efficient so that it can attract more investment from the outside also. And already Ayesha mentioned our capital market problems, and also there is a very poor bond market. This has not been built up very well. So there are lots of work to do with the bond market and also capital market so that foreigners or investors can come off and invest in those markets. And according to, I think, World Bank statistics, is that the cost of doing business is a bit higher, but I think government is also working on this. They have taken a project to reduce the cost of doing business. For this, our, I think, efficient bureaucracy is also an important part, and it is also necessary to take some measures so that cost of doing business can be reduced to some extent. And also, another issue, the main issues is gas and electricity that hampers certain level of industrialization. So government's current approach has already Ayesha pointed out that there is around some mega projects are on the way, Rupurpa nuclear projects and some other projects are in the process. Already 87% of the households have access to electricity. There are 12% of the people have access to renewable energy, but still we need uninterrupted electricity, and the progress of the project should be made very quicker, and so that this kind of problem can be solved in a short way. And land scarcity issues, already I said that some special economic zones are underway, so investors can find them in a very viable way so that they can invest in those special economic zones. And definitely political issues sometimes create some uncertainties among businesses. So this should be the current level of a stabilized situation might help them to get more confidence in investing in those in Bangladesh. The second concern, apart from investment, is the export diversification issues. In Bangladesh, ready-made garments constitute more than 80% of its export. So one sector is getting more concentration, so that this is a kind of, I think, weaknesses also from our part. So diversification is always on the table of discussion. So you see that this 80% or more, we have the export from the garment sector. At the same time, you can see that the second part, you can see that apart from garments, the second largest export item is the leather and leather products, then frozen food and agri products, then raw jute and jute goods. So it is always a concern how to diversify the export basket. The problem is that it is not easy to diversify in a overnight. The problem has to be solved in a different way. For example, RMG development has not come overnight, definitely. It started in the process, started in the late 70s, then there are lots of issues come, and then this sector grows up. But within RMG sector, there has been a lot of diversification. There is scope of diversification. Bangladeshi garments products are kind of low-end products, but they are very much competitive in the world market. That's why Bangladesh's position in apparel market is the second largest in the world after China. So Bangladesh already has their place in the world market, and that has to be capitalized for other goods and services. So what next after RMG? If you look at the East Asian case for developing RMG export diversification, you see that all those Japan, NIS, ASEAN 4, latecomers, latest comers, they started with garments. And then they diversified in the steel, and then electronics, video, and other things. I think for Bangladesh also this is true. Our next target should be ICTs and electronics. Already Bangladesh has some footholds in electronics market. Walton is a big case. I think many other companies are assembling many other LED TVs and mobile phones and others. I think they will be starting manufacturing soon. So this is the only sector I see a great prospect for developing a diversified export market. So what should be the process? Already we have heard about the GSP quota-free access will be eliminated once we develop from the LDC, but we will have still GSP plus facilities, but that will be after 2027. So we should not be worried much about this. As I already said, Bangladesh, once it was said that once MFN has been removed, Bangladesh the garment sector will be in trouble, but we have not been in that position. The reason is that Bangladesh already achieved certain level of competitiveness in the world market, and therefore I also don't think that this will make a big problem for the Bangladesh. But the problem is we have to diversify our product so that we can have greater access to the market as well as competitiveness. So as I already said, within FMC there has been a lot of diversification, high fashion products, quality products are on the way. So the government has to do some workplace safety and compliance issues, and that must be underway, and there should have some institutions set up to oversee all those processes. Finally, I would say that simply I will focus on financing for development. The main big challenge for Bangladesh is to improve its tax GDP ratio, revenue mobilization, because once Bangladesh graduates from LDC status, then the opportunity for having concessional loans, grants, others will be squeezed. So at that time, for financing development, we have to increase our tax revenue earnings. Though we have our scope of generating more revenues from the local sources, but still Bangladesh position in terms of tax GDP ratio even lower than all other South Asian countries. So there is a scope of increasing this. For this, we have to improve the capacity of our National Board of Revenue, and also enforcing the laws and other things so that we can improve the tax GDP ratio situation. I will not focus much on remittance and other things, but at the same time, what would happen to foreign resources? You see that two graphs are shown here. One shows that Bangladesh aid or ODA as percentage of GNI has been declining from 1980s. It is now just almost 1%. So Bangladesh already achieved certain level of confidence in financing development. So even if you see the other graphs which show the other South Asian countries' situation, those countries are becoming more developed. Their dependence on aid or ODA has been declining. So we have already achieved that level. So it will not be very much worrying for us, but we definitely have to do something to expedite the process of getting more ODAs and other things. For this, we have to utilize the pipelines, what we have been committed to do, and at the same time, we have to look for alternative financing. So what will be the alternative financing? That could be South-South cooperation, there should be bilateral negotiations with FTAs, bond issuance in the international market, and also some other climate change fund, Gavi fund, and others. So we have to focus on those kinds of funds so that we can continue with our development process. With this, I would like to thank and stop here.
Thank you, Monzur. You covered a lot of ground. You handled sort of the points with regard to investments, export diversification. You went to make the point that when Bangladesh graduated from the multi-fiber agreement, for instance, a lot of people predicted doomsday for the garment industry, but that didn't quite happen. So the next area probably would be, and Ayesha had touched upon that also, ICT and electronics. And Chairman Pillai had spoken of the non-technological resources of Bangladesh as well, which is the intellectual resources. And that could be pressed into the service of this entirely new phenomena, which Bangladesh is very good at. I mean, leapfrogging from one level of development to another. And let's keep our fingers crossed with regard to that. Dr. Our next speaker, he's a senior research fellow and he's research lead for trade and economics at ISAS, and he will speak to Bangladesh's role as a regional and global actor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chowdhury. And in fact, after the very rich and illuminating presentations by my preceding speakers, I think what I'll do is that I'll change the context a bit and look at this particular development for Bangladesh from a broader regional perspective and what it means for the region and what it means in totality in the current spectrum of economic developments that are taking place around us. The first point that I'd like to make in this context is Bangladesh's graduation is a significant development for South Asia. South Asia began, it still has 8 countries, and out of which 5 were the least developed countries, and these include Afghanistan, Bhutan, Maldives, Nepal, and Bangladesh. Maldives was the first to graduate, and it moved out. In fact, one needs to take note of the fact as High Commissioner mentioned in his opening remarks, only 5 countries till now have been actually successfully able to graduate from being a least developed country to a low middle income country. Maldives was the first from South Asia. Bangladesh is the next, and it's kind of becoming a bit infectious in the region now because Bhutan and Nepal are almost there. They're inching closer to the mark. So what this means is that maybe over the next 6 to 7 years, South Asia will no longer be identified as one of the poorest regions of the world, and there are countries from here which are going to cross the border, so as to say, from being among the poorest. The other interesting point to notice, and this is where I'd like to connect to one of the points that Dr. Chowdhury mentioned, the year 2005 was when the multi-fiber agreement ceased to operate. For Bangladesh, for my preceding speakers elaborated upon the character of Bangladesh's economic growth, the time trajectories. It's interesting to note that it is 2006 which actually turned out to be the inflection point for Bangladesh's economic rise. And it is even more interesting to note that 2008 was the year of the global financial crisis. Now from 2008 onward, there have actually been very few national economic success stories for the world to take note of. Bangladesh is a very rare case in that respect, and which essentially shows that it is a country which has been able to maintain a successful trajectory of high economic growth. And when I say high economic growth, let me qualify this with the fact that this high rate of economic growth was accompanied by a lower rate of growth in population. As a result of which it became possible for Bangladesh to meet the per capita income criteria. And along with, of course, the other most celebrated stories of social development and human development. But this is a very interesting example of a phase in world history and even regional history, when while global financial crisis has turned back the clock against many countries, including those countries which were resource exporters and commodity exporters, which are now struggling to find a place for themselves in the global economic map, Bangladesh has been able to successfully go against this trend and create a position for itself. And obviously on the basis of just not income, but also human development and economic vulnerability. How did it do this? Well, there would be a lot of literature explaining that. My earlier speakers have also alluded to the fact. But let me point to one particular character of this growth. We talk about a particular category of export-dedicated initiatives called the special economic zones. Now, special economic zones are what many countries in the world have tried to employ for good, unqualified, sustained economic success year after year. The biggest example, of course, is China. Now let's look at South Asia. In South Asia, the first country to start experimenting with special economic zone, many of you might not be knowing this, was actually India. India built the world's third special economic zone at Kandla in Gujarat in 1966. This was much before China came up with Shenzhen or Guangdong or the other zones. But for a variety of reasons, special economic zones have not delivered India the success they have, not only in China, but in many other parts of the world. And this is where I want to bring into focus an important fact. When we look at a country like Maldives, for example, which graduated from South Asia, when we look at a country like Bhutan, which is close to the graduation mark, when we look at Nepal, close to the graduation mark, all these are economic successes driven by services, primarily tourism. Bangladesh is a remarkable exception of a country which has graduated on the basis of manufacturing. And to many who consider manufacturing to be the powerhouse of economic growth for most countries to go ahead, Bangladesh will remain a major example. As we look back at history, economic history of this period, Bangladesh will remain a major example, A, for the fact manufacturing contributed to its growth, notwithstanding the fact that ready-made garments were the bulk of the story. Also the fact that special economic zones contributed very, very much to this manufacturing story, including examples like the Chittagong Export Processing Zone, for example, which way back in 2010 was actually declared by the FDI magazine to be the third most cost competitiveness zone in the world. Now that speaks volumes about the ability of a country to bring together a set of supportive factors which were focused in utilizing the advantages that it was obtaining from the rest of the world in its status as a least developed country in terms of preferential access. And this pushed the growth trajectory very fast. The point over here is that this now is a situation which is going to change, undoubtedly. And again, this is what my earlier speakers have alluded to, because not being a LDC does bring status, but it does not really bring any economic benefits. And as the High Commissioner very categorically mentioned in his speech earlier, preferential access, the unilateral preferential access in terms of duty-free, quota-free access is now going to go, which essentially means that while Bangladesh's exports were available to a large number of markets, particularly the developed country markets, at a lower cost, these costs are not going to be restored to the original price. So which essentially means that in order to remain competitive in these markets, Bangladeshi exports will have to achieve that additional competitiveness from some other improvements. What are those improvements going to be? Well, this is where trade essentially becomes a domestic story. And the good part is, I'll come to the difficult part later, but I'll allude to the good part earlier. The good part is that Bangladesh has, over the last few years, been quite intelligently being able to be a part of a regional supply chain. And what is the biggest example of that? The biggest example of that is Bangladesh is now the largest importer of Indian cotton. Earlier it was China, which was the largest importer of Indian raw cotton. Today Bangladesh is the largest importer of Indian raw cotton, which means that the garment manufacturers in Bangladesh have been able to very effectively tap on the fact that there is a large amount of raw material available in the region, in the neighborhood, at competitive rates, which should be tapped upon, which should be imported by the country for use in the middle level of the garment value chain, in the stitching, knitting, apparel segment for further exports. Now, this is a value chain which is going to sustain. India doesn't mind this because India does not have the competitive advantages, the middle level of the garment chain. India's competitive advantages are at the raw material stage and finally at the design stage, not at the middle level, where Bangladesh fits in very nicely into the story. The problem or the challenge for Bangladesh will arise in the fact that there are competitors like Vietnam and Cambodia, which have an ability to suppress wages because of various factors. Bangladesh doesn't. So that is where there will be a wage issue that will be coming onto the story at some stage. But for the time being, and at least for even 3 to 4 years from now on, this is a supply chain where Bangladesh is capitalizing on the resource advantages of the region to push ahead in the garment segment. The second, it's probably not known to many that when it comes to digital transactions, Bangladesh actually has a much higher ratio than the entire region. If one looks at the bank accounts across the country, 34% of Bangladesh bank accounts carry out digital transactions regularly on an active basis, and this is much higher than only 25% for the rest of South Asia. So this is where intermediation cost is already being cut down. And this is a good development to be sustained. And the third, again a progressive development looking ahead of the curve, is the increasing application of artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques in various parts of the Bangladesh economy. And I just quote one example, which is the use of sensors in detecting the arsenic content of drinking water, which I think is a very notable application to have come in. Let me now come to the less positive part, which are the challenges. One of my earlier speakers alluded to the difficulty of doing business. Now, to be very honest with you, I think as an economist, one does not attach too much of importance to the ranks and numbers that the doing business list brings out. But the problem is, this is a list which generates perceptions. And the perception becomes acute when one sees that Bangladesh is ranked at 177 out of around 194 countries of the world. Now, doing business looked at totality is also a qualitative perception. And if one looks deeper into the subcategories of index, one realizes that there are certain areas where Bangladesh hasn't done too badly. Like say, for example, in giving the security or protecting the rights of minority investors. Its doing business rank is much better. It's in the early 70s. But the areas where it lags behind are actually the areas where the whole of the region lags behind. So in that case, the connection with the region is very organic. Like say, for example, registering property, enforcing contracts. These are typically, Ayesha alluded to getting electricity. Yes, one of the lowest indicators on doing business. So these are typically the areas where Bangladesh is very South Asia. And it is as much affected, with probably the exception of Sri Lanka to an extent, it's much affected by the rest of the region as these indicators would allow. And the problem is this influences perceptions. This influences perceptions, and this is where maybe a lot of local level action is required to correct the situation on ground. This doesn't happen overnight. This takes time, but for that period at least, there will be an if connected with the fact that this is an economy which shows high per capita income growth, and therefore from an investor's perspective is a good prospect. But if it runs into problems of electricity, of registering property, of getting results on contracts, will the investment sustain? I think this is a challenge which the policymakers will have to encounter. The second challenge, after graduation, the questions will become tougher at the post-graduation level. And what are these questions going to be like? Now countries will start demanding more from Bangladesh on exports, particularly. Say for example, now the questions will no longer be on tariffs. Now the questions will be on quality. Maintaining standards, conformity assessment. And this is where the challenge is very large. Why is it large? A, because there is a question of capacity. Where does the capacity question come in? Are there adequate testing and certification facilities which would conform products at a domestic level which is compatible with the international standard level? Let's say, for example, if Bangladesh is exporting final garment products, let's say to a country like Canada, which it does extensively now, and Canada withdraws the DFQF, which it will sooner or later. Well, as long as it was DFQF, there were a number of quality issues which could be kept under the surface. Now, no more. So does it have that certification capacity, or is it a question that these products will, let us say for example, after being ready, will have to ship to a center like Dubai for accessing the laboratory and certification facilities, brought back, and then shipped all the way in a different geographic direction for reaching Canada? Higher costs. I'm not too sure if a retailer like the H&M will be too interested in heavy level of sourcing if these are the costs that are coming in. So which means domestic capacity development has to come in at a much greater level, and more importantly, awareness. Awareness among exporters that these standards have to be met and complied with. Because otherwise, these are typically the measures that many countries will erect just to deny access. And now it's a brutal game. It's no more a question of a soft corner, it's a brutal game. You have graduated, you are now in the big league, so survive on your own. So what's an effective strategy looking ahead? And this is where I think I'm just giving my own contribution. I'm trying to rethink the economic geography. Bangladesh has benefited tremendously by relying on OECD markets. I think the time has come to change the focus. Let's look at the geography. What's the core geography of Bangladesh? I would say it's the Bay of Bengal. Bay of Bengal gives Bangladesh the kind of advantage which nothing else gives, and developments around Bay of Bengal are equally substantive. And Bangladesh is already, maybe without knowing, consciously, it's already a part of this development. It's a part of the BIMSTEC. It's a part of internal networks like BBIN, and probably now the time has come to think of an integrated strategy where it becomes a part of the developments that are taking place in Myanmar, in Thailand, in India, along the Bay of Bengal core. And the next obvious step will be to consider becoming part of Bay of Bengal based free trade agreements like the RCEP, which is soon going to conclude. And there is no reason why Bangladesh should not be allowed entry into these countries, because now Bangladesh will not ask for exceptions. Earlier, let's say for example, we know from the ASEAN experience, Cambodia, Laos and Myanmar need to be given exceptions because they're least developed countries when it comes to tariff concession. It's no more the case for Bangladesh. It's the uniform standard schedules that will apply to Bangladesh when it is negotiating with other countries. So other countries will not think that, look, negotiating with this country comes with a block, a caveat, that 70% of the story will have to be kept away, only 30% will need to be focused on. It's now a whole open basket. So if this can be brought into play, a sub-regional growth strategy which is pushed up a little higher to the next level, there is a very strong possibility that Bangladesh goes back to what it has been able to very successfully practice, the special economic zone and the value chain strategy, because zones like the Chittagong zone are already roaring. There are parallel zones that are coming up in places like Myanmar. There are Indian companies which are gunning to export in Bangladesh. India and Bangladesh have entered into a bilateral investment protection agreement. The Reserve Bank of India, of all countries, welcomes investment from Bangladesh. So I think the story has become a very different now, where special purpose vehicles located in various parts of the world, including prominently Singapore, can actually think of choosing their locations, not just in India or Bangladesh, in the entire sub-region, as part of the entire value chain. So that, in fact, becomes a very proactive strategy if played well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid. That was excellent. I just want to make 3 very quick points from the discussions that have taken place so far. One is the point that you made about Bangladesh being the only LDC country to graduate with manufacturing as the driver. Now that's very important because there is a list of about 50 least developed countries. Some of them are very small, so small that it used to be said that if you caught a large fish in one of these countries, the GDP would double in a day. You see? So Bangladesh is a completely different story. It has had to negotiate its status even within the LDCs because there was a continuous negotiation, as you know, with the United States, for instance, where we did not have the kind of access we had into Europe. So that's important. I used to believe that I'm all for graduation, of course. I believe that ultimately preferences prolong pain, and it's better to get into the real fight while you can. A second point is there is also a political impact of, in global diplomacy, there will be impact of Bangladesh's graduation from LDC. As I said, LDC comprises about 50 countries, which Bangladesh led in the global system. In the United Nations, WTO, special and differential treatment negotiations, Bangladesh led these 50 countries. Today Bangladesh, on the one hand, will probably lose this very large following in the international community of these least developed countries, and these developed countries will lose a leader in negotiations like Bangladesh, which was a very effective leader for them. But then Bangladesh will graduate into G77. Within the developing countries, as you know, the relationship between the LDCs and G77s was very complex. It was not necessarily one of a harmonious one. So Bangladesh will graduate into G77 and should be on its way as a middle-income developing country. Okay, I will open the floor for questions, answers, comments. I would ask that you identify yourself and you also identify your affiliation. The floor is open. Yes, Mr. Jumaboy first and then Anish.
Thank you very much. It's been a very, very impressive session. And we've seen a country coming out from deep poverty to a successful level and growth. I was wondering, another great achievement of Bangladesh was microfinance and its influence on women. And nobody mentions about microfinance. Now this is something that you should be very proud of. So I was wondering why it's always been left out, you see.
High Commissioner mentioned microfinance.
So that's what but I think the emphasis has to be much more, because Bangladesh, in fact, surprised the whole world. And in Singapore, we had the gentleman who started microfinance speak to us in the universities. That's the only thing I want to say. But thank you very much for everything, and wish Bangladesh moves higher up the economic level and its people. One other question. At one time in its history, you had the Bangladesh Shipping Corporation. I remember helping them out here in Singapore. At that time, I had a lot to do with actual shipping. I'm wondering what has happened to that institution. It was a government institution. Thank you very much.
Anish Mishra.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I would first like to start by congratulating Bangladesh for graduating from LDC status, given that this took place just in March this year. It has proved that the basket case has finally kicked the basket. And the point and the things that, although this is something that should have happened a long time back, and it could have happened if Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was allowed to govern Bangladesh for another 15 to 20 years. But what happened to him was very unfortunate. Okay, my question is that as Bangladesh becomes economically prosperous, what is the wealth distribution network that's in place to ensure that not just the capitalists of Bangladesh keeps the wealth, but the wealth is distributed widely in Bangladesh? I think Ms. Khan very correctly started her presentation by talking about the ideological infrastructure. So I think that's it's along those lines. And this second question that I want to ask is that if the requirements on the LDC list is revised by United Nations, is there a possibility that Bangladesh may be back on the list? Because if you look at the list, I mean, this is actually a graduation from least developed country to less developed country, because it's still very low requirements. And if the requirements on the list is revised, I actually see a possibility that Bangladesh will get back on the list, and then what we are talking about today will no longer be significant. So these are my questions and my comments. Thank you very much.
Okay, are you directing it at any of the panelists?
No,
or
anyone
are you throwing it open to
the
the panel? In which case, maybe, would you like to take that? I will also respond to it, but would you like to go first? Well, while you're fixing your mic, let me take the floor. With regard to Mr. Jumaboy's points, the 2 points that he made, one is, of course, with regard to microcredit. It's well known that Bangladesh was the leader of microcredit. Much of the world today, in Africa, Afghanistan, etc., they are marching to the tune that was first piped in Bangladesh with regard to microcredit. Microcredit, of course, which the High Commissioner had mentioned, by the way, is somewhat limited to poverty alleviation. Now, this is big league hawk economics, as one would say in German. This is high. We are into trade, we are into investments. So we are actually focused on a little different sectors in this discussion, but you're quite right to say that microcredit is something that Bangladesh has given the world leadership, owns the leadership, and is recognized as such. With regard to your question on Bangladesh Shipping Corporation, I mean, the times that you were involved, Bangladesh didn't even have a tonnage in shipping, and the first procurement was perhaps in the summer of 1972, 10,000 tons shipped purchased from India, 10 years old, etc., which was the first ship of the BSC. Eventually today, Bangladesh has the largest shipping tonnage among all these developed countries. There has been considerable progress, and it's not just even ship procurements, but also ship breaking is an industry that Bangladesh is not necessarily absolutely proud of, but it is on the upper high, among the top few. Dr. Pali, you might want to...
Excuse me, sir. Can I make a correction over here?
Yeah.
My name is Rafiq, I'm from ExxonMobil.
Yeah.
Reference Mr. Jumaboy's question on Bangladesh Shipping Corporation and what they're doing. I would like to tell you that because I did participate in a bid, Bangladesh Shipping Corporation is coming out with 6 new buildings from China. 3 will be bulk carriers and 3 will be product carriers. If you look at shipping in general, and if you look at the history of shipping around government-led companies, a lot of them have sort of merged, sold, moved into other directions. But I am very pleased to say that Bangladesh Shipping Corporation has invested in new buildings. In the past, we had about 26 ships. Today, they are again coming up. So, Mr. Jumaboy, you were one of the first persons to get involved in shipping with Bangladesh. Good luck for you. There is more coming on the way. Thank you very much.
Well, if criteria are revised when it comes to judging the economic classification of countries. Statistically, there could be many possibilities. But I think what is important to note is that when it comes to Bangladesh, or for that matter, any countries that have made the graduation, those are not a point in time decisions. They have actually had to comply with this for a minimum time period, and which in Bangladesh's case has been 3 years, like it has been for other countries. And I think the more notable part is that it's the economic size, which makes Bangladesh a significant outlier, I would say, in the list of all the other LDCs, because other LDCs also prominently comprise of small and vulnerable economies and landlocked countries and so on and so forth. But Bangladesh is exception in the sense that if this is an economy which is just not the world's, one of the world's largest economies in terms of being in the top 30s, it's also one of the world's most populous economies. So when that economy makes a leap, at least on the per capita income basis, it has a significant impact on the per capita income level for the whole world. I mean, it's just to say that if China has been able to lift millions out of poverty, it has made a great impact on global poverty itself. And I think Bangladesh's success is a success that is to be looked at in that context as well. It makes a great difference to the region and the world.
Okay, thank you. Just another point. You see, with regard to list of LDCs, there are two actually. LDC is a United Nations chart. It's a United Nations expression. The World Bank talks of LLDCs. If you're in the World Bank, a list of least developed countries, you will be called LLDCs. Now, while in theory it's quite possible that one might slip down into LDC status, but in practical terms, it is inconceivable that the rest of the world who does business with Bangladesh will allow Bangladesh, will recognize Bangladesh as an LDC once again. As you say that it's one of the 8th, 9th largest countries in the world in terms of population, to give Bangladesh the same facilities they have given before. This is going to be well nigh impossible for the rest of the world to agree. So it's not just Bangladesh slipping down, it's the questions of other countries acknowledging that Bangladesh has slipped. And that's not likely to happen. Dr. Hossain, you wanted to say something?
Thank you very much. I would like to say about something about this question about whether Bangladesh will slip again to LDC point. If it is theoretically possible, I think practically it is almost impossible. The reason is that if you look into the growth trajectory of Bangladesh, it's the private sector-led growth, definitely export-led growth. So already one mentioned about the microfinance, and there are lots of success stories, including microfinance, mobile financial services, mobile technologies. So this kind of growth is very difficult to, I think, kind of devastating if there is nothing happen like this. Otherwise, it's very difficult to slip down from this point of view. And also, if you see about the economic vulnerability, only one point is export concentration. I think I already mentioned about that, because though we have concentrated only one sector, but there are lots of diversification within the sector, and Bangladesh export sector has already achieved certain level of competitiveness in the world market. And that's why it seems to be very difficult for us to come back to LDC again after 6 years, but at the same time we should not be complacent about this. We have to continue with the process, and what we have discussed about the priorities and all the challenges, we have to continue to work on it. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Ayesha Khan.
The gentleman behind the back of the room asked about distribution of wealth. In Bangladesh, the distribution of wealth right now is happening in a very plain vanilla basis, which is taxing the people earning and then distributing that through social safety networks, or providing subsidized education, subsidized healthcare to the poorer or the parts of the population that's in a lower economic threshold. That's a very basic one. I think most economic students understand that, and that's not really what we need to focus on. What's happening in Bangladesh, which is much more unique, is Bangladesh's growth, which is now extraordinary. You're talking about 8%, 7 to 8% of an economy, 165 million
people, or 170 million people, depending on who you ask, growing by 8% year on year for 10 years. And that growth is coming, as my colleague, as my panelist over just said, to the manufacturing sector. Manufacturing sector is not it's not a sector which has few owners. It's not a sector which is controlled by monopolies. It's a very broad-based sector. Multiple owners employing millions of people. And that itself is distributing the wealth, much more than in countries where the growth is based out of commodities, natural resources, services, whereby the ownership is much more controlled, and there's a monopoly or an oligopoly or a few owners or a few controlling institutions controlling the growth. In Bangladesh, the growth is, as it is, very distributed. Another point I would quickly like to make is, to round up everybody thinks of Bangladesh as a small country. Geographically, it's small, but 165 million people in a country the size of Bangladesh, the kind of capacity that we're talking about is extraordinary. One of the things I like to talk about is Summit will be generating about 3,000 megawatts in another 5 years' time. That's 50% of Singapore's total generation capacity. And that would just be the private sector of a country. One company in the private sector of the country would be generating 50% of one of the most developed countries in the world. Singapore and Bangladesh, in that sense, it's absolutely opposite in its characteristics. Bangladesh is poor but very big in terms of population. Singapore is very rich but with a very small population base. So the parameters and the scale that is happening in Bangladesh is very different. In Bangladesh, companies will be growing in billions of dollars because that capacity is there, that demand is there.
Yeah, and add to all this the two nuclear power plants that I've talked of, 2023, 2024. So we're going into an entirely different league. Okay, the floor is still open. Ladies and gentlemen. Yes, identify yourself and then.
My name is Mr Md I'm the media's first president of Bangladesh Business Chamber. I will start with first thanking the ISAS and the chairman, Mr. Dr. Iftekhar. Good to see you very active at this age. My first question. No, because as I say, it's noteworthy to mention that the Bangladesh economic turnaround started around 2006-2007 when Dr. Iftekhar was perhaps the economic foreign advisor, I guess. Okay, that's past. Let me come back to this question to Ms. Ayesha Aziz Khan. You rightly said about this, what do you call it, the infrastructure development, social infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and all these things. So here, the access to capital and its mobility. I would assume that you mean the mobility means to how easily you can transfer the fund to Bangladesh, and having invested and have some capital gain, how could you repatriate back to your country of origin? Here I see we have an issue with Bangladesh current policies where how do you propose that we could do? Because the acute currency control prevents this easy mobility of capital transfers. We tried individually with some companies through some time. At that time it was a board of investment, now it is BIDA, right? So all these are, I guess when we actually try to do that, we see that there's a set of rules which prevent from having that required, required confidence in bringing the investors into Bangladesh who, you say the foreign direct investments have been, because the question arises that how do I get back? Nobody wants to invest and lose money. So that's, I would say that this is, perhaps the question is for the policymakers. And then one more thing that I said that these are all very vital. I mean, a good balance between education, healthcare, roads and highways, and electricity. But I have to keep in mind on the environment issue also, because as the industrial development gets hyper, this environment issue comes into place. So I will try, because your company or your group is playing a big role in the infrastructure development in Bangladesh. And I see wherever I go, I have the opportunity to go around. All these diesel power plants are a big source of environmental disaster. I mean, you're going to have acid rains and sulfur ashes coming around and destroying the greeneries around. So we feel that the policymakers should look into it. And then to Dr. Monzur Hossain, I mean, you mentioned the diversity of Bangladesh's industrial production. I would say that if you just focus, give us some inputs from your perspective, that besides the visible one like garments, ready-made garments, or leather, ceramics and all, what others that we could encourage the investors to look into for Bangladesh. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. On the first question about foreign direct investment, my point, or the point I was trying to submit to all of you, is that Bangladesh does have a restrictive foreign exchange control compared to some of the big developed countries, but I don't think it's extraordinarily strict. I don't think it's extraordinarily controlling. It's very similar to what India had even 10 years back, what Pakistan has right now, what China has had even 5 years back. So the place where Bangladesh is, where it's developing very fast, it does require some amount of controlled foreign exchange policies, which Bangladesh has, and I completely understand. I don't think that's really the absolute barrier for foreign exchange inflow and outflow. It's more a barrier on both sides. The countries that can participate in Bangladesh's capital growth, or can participate in putting capital in Bangladesh, needs to also understand what Bangladesh needs, and the Bangladesh policymakers need to understand how to bring this capital. So the laws doesn't really need to change. It's more a working level understanding between the capital provider and the capital taker that needs to take place. For example, Bangladesh needs to be able to allow many more instruments to be invested in, a market for it to open up, whereby capital providers can provide that capital in multiple ways. Straightforward equity is very easy to do, but normally straightforward equity is the last kind of capital that enters a country. It is first the mezzanine kind of equities that first flow through. Capital investment that has certain amount of security built in. So Bangladesh and the countries that can invest into Bangladesh need to sit together and figure out how to come up with a working solution, which is where I believe that Singapore would play a very strong role, because Singapore has a regulatory environment and the supporting framework and a very good transparent banking system that can allow for Bangladesh to use this as a platform to receive funds and then distribute funds out. You had a point on environment as well. Absolutely agree with you. When we're doing infrastructure, we need to be very conscious about the environment. Bangladesh is a country that has been very conscious about environment. We're one of the countries that have signed up to all the environmental frameworks, realizing it's a country that will be very effective when there is environmental change, when there is more, and when the effect comes to the coastal parts of the world. Bangladesh having the largest coast in the country with the largest coast, and the present government, including the Prime Minister, has been a big advocate of that.
First of all, I would like to respond to that question about capital mobility. I think Bangladesh still has not made the capital account convertible fully, but so far I know there is a certain limited limited level of capital mobility based on some selective basis. So there is a high-level committee, and they scrutinize the applications and then allow some level of capital mobility. But I still, as an economist, I think that With our current level of foreign exchange reserves, $33 billion level, we should not very much worried about the capital account convertible, since we are going to be graduated from the LDC status. So we need to open up our market and also we need to invite more foreign investment. So I am in favor of making gradual convertibility of the capital account. So I think the government should think about it, and they should start processing the capital account convertibility to make it consistent with the other developed country level. The second question you mentioned about the diversification of our export basket. I already mentioned about this because we already achieved $30 billion amount of export from the RNG sector out of 35 or 36 billion total export. But the next highest one is the leather sector. That is only worth of $2 billion export level. And jute and others also lower than that level. So considering the capacity of producing leather and leather goods and others, I don't see mass progress or mass prospect of leather and other things that can achieve the level of R&D. So only the other sector that I can see, that is the electronics and ICT sector. Bangladesh already in a good position to have the demographic dividend. I tried to mention, but because of time limitations, I did not mention about this. We are in the process. We are having fortunate to have that demographic dividend. About 60% working age population at this moment in Bangladesh. So that is they are talented enough. About 5,000 or 8,000 graduates, ICT graduates are coming out every year. We have around 70 universities and others. So this is only the sector that can help Bangladesh leapfrog from this level of development. So I think investors can also think of investing in the manufacturing of electronics and ICT sector and other things. I think since being a neighbor of India, the ICT giant, I think it has a comparative advantage of taking Bangladesh into the next level of development. I think this is the only area where we can invest more in.
Sorry, if there be, okay, Professor? Please, Mike. This will be the last question.
Thank you for organizing such a wonderful session. I think what I gathered here, and from my experience as well, by the way, I did introduce myself. I'm from National University of Singapore. Okay. I think very encouraging driving force of the economy in Bangladesh is manufacturing. We are very proud of that. And in manufacturing, what I feel is that technology or innovation, whatever it is, homegrown. That is again very much admirable, mostly in garments. And Bangladesh is creating opportunities for investors for manufacturing. But I'm a little concerned whether there is any definite plan from Bangladesh government to invite manufacturers, and there should be a definite policy, and areas should be identified where investment has very high return for possibility of faster growth, less competition, niche areas. All these, I think, need to be planned and told to the world that is where we are concentrating. These are our policies, and you are welcome to come. Otherwise, creating land and telling them come and do it, they will lost which sectors should go there. So rather we should take initiative to invite them in specific areas, and for that we need definite plan. That is my request.
Thank you. Would you like to respond to it? Okay. The point is, yes, the points are very well taken, but might I just assure you that these points are certainly beyond, having been, once upon a time, been a policymaker myself, the policy-making elements in Bangladesh are fully cognizant of the points you are making. These are the challenges, But these steps are naturally being considered, being thought of. That is why we have a huge public sector machinery in place. We have planners, we have civil servants, we have our political masters who give the leadership, and we have people like you who give ideas in fora such as this. And these ideas, I'm sure, will be recorded, will be transmitted, and a policy process will evolve and generate from the kind of resonance it finds among the community, as is doing here this evening. Anyway, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm about to bring these proceedings to a close, but it should be terribly remiss of me if I were to do that without extending my sincere thanks to the excellent panelists that we have had here. Let's give them a you might continue to clap, or you might do it again for the excellent audience we have had here this evening. Some have asked questions, and others have participated by just being here. On behalf of ISAS, I should like to thank High Commissioner Mustafizur Rahman and his excellent team, many of whom are here, for the support. First of all, for what they're doing for Bangladesh in Singapore, and we owe them a debt of gratitude for that, and also for partnering this particular event with us. Plaudits for the success is also owed to my colleagues, Hernaik Singh, Jordan, Sylvia, Yusuf, and all others at ISAS who have worked tirelessly to make this event a success. We have indeed had an extremely stimulating discussion. I shan't attempt a summary, but if there is to be one, it is that Bangladesh is truly in the cusp of changes. Of course, there are challenges, but these challenges have to be overcome, and it will most certainly be the case, for has it not been aptly said that man's reach should exceed his grasp? What else are the heavens for? I thank you. Well, Sylvia.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, distinguished panelists. I would like now to invite Dr. Chowdhury to present some tokens of appreciation to our invited panelists. To Ms. Ayesha Aziz Khan. And to Dr. Monzur Hossain.
Thank you very much.
With that, we have come to the end of this panel discussion. We thank you for your kind participation and look forward to seeing you again at our next ISAS event. Have a good evening.